increasingly, black South Africans felt that even if this sounded kind of theoretically plausible, in practice it turned out that the really great farmland went for the use of the white people. And even in the Bantustans, in the black homelands, the power really still resided with the white government. And so starting in about 1912, in an organized way, people who were opposed to racism organized into various political movements. Then from 1948, when the apartheid government really started to enforce its role, it became more active. And in 1961, the African National Congress and its created an armed wing called Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, and started engaging in acts of armed resistance against the apartheid regime. All of the various significant resistance movements at that time were banned. And a number of people, including Nelson Mandela, whose name you may recall, were put in prison. And so there was a period from 1961 onward of resistance against apartheid. That came to an end in 1990 with the release of Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners and the unbanning of the resistance movements. And then in 1994, South Africa had its first democratic elections, after which the new parliament decided that it was important for South Africa to come to grips with the history from 1961 until 1993. And so it set up this body called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was mandated to investigate gross human rights violations from 1961 until 1993 in its final mandate, as I recall it. Gross human rights violations included, in particular, abduction, torture, and murder. And so various people were invited to come and tell the truth about their experience of abduction, torture, and murder, either as victims, surviving victims, or as the survivors of victims who died, or as perpetrators. And the Commission offered an amnesty to perpetrators who would come forward and tell the truth about what they did, provided they had actually done an act that was a gross human rights violation, provided they told the whole truth, provided they acted under the auspices of a political organization, and provided that the act had a political intent. And so people did come forward. Initially, when I started working as an interpreter for the Commission, most of the testimony that I interpreted was testimony by victims. Towards the end of 1996, most of the testimony that I interpreted was in-camera testimony by perpetrators. It involved detailed explanations of specific, usually specific acts of terror or of torture or murder. An interpreter is not, we liked to say when we were working for the Commission, is not a language tube. So you don't have the person telling the original story speaking, and then it sort of goes into the ear of the interpreter and it comes out of the mouth of the interpreter into the ears of the other people in the room without being changed. So an interpreter really does interpret. It's sort of fly by the seat of your pants, hermeneutics going on. But also, because the interpreter is a human being, the process of interpreting affects the interpreter. So this is what I really want to get to over these 2 days. The effects of interpreting these stories on me and how that brought about moral formation in my case. It's really not the most important part of these stories, because compared to the actual victims and the actual perpetrators, my part in what took place there was negligible. But it was my part. And so that's what I have to bring to you and to share with you. two things really messed me up while I was working for the commission. Broke my heart to the point of my nearly falling apart completely and very nearly completely messing up my marriage. The first of these things was victim testimony about children dying. My own children were younger than 10 at the time, and so I could really live myself into. Now remember, I'm telling these things in the first person. Someone will say, and this happened, and I'm repeating their words. And over time, it started feeling like I was recounting my experiences in a weird way. And so when talking about children, I really connected with it, and not to my own direct and immediate benefit. And the other thing that really messed me up, which I'm not going to be going into over these 2 days, is testimony by perpetrators about acts of torture. So let me tell you about testimony of 3 people. These were the 3 occasions when I nearly didn't make it through the interpreting process. Athlone is a neighborhood near the city of Cape Town that was, at the time that these events took place, inhabited entirely by people who were defined in South African law as colored. That meant they were mixed race. So they had their own racial designation. And this particular community had a very large proportion of people who were Muslim. They spoke Afrikaans, so they spoke the same language as I do. They were brought, usually as political prisoners, to South Africa, their ancestors, by the Dutch from Indonesia, what's now Indonesia. And at the Cape of Good Hope, they became a primarily Afrikaans-speaking community, but Muslim. So this is testimony from Mrs. Zainab Rycliffe. She gave the original testimony in Afrikaans. I translated it into English, so these were my words, and so if they're clunky, that's because I was interpreting on the fly. She is giving testimony about something called the Trojan horse incident. In the community of Athlone, teenagers felt that they wanted to resist apartheid somehow. And because they didn't have much available to do that with, what they primarily did is they resorted to throwing stones at vehicles in sort of acts of protest. And initially they would throw stones at police vans when they came through the neighborhood, or at military trucks who often patrolled the neighborhood. But for reasons unknown to me, they also decided that they wanted to stone bread trucks. So these teenagers in Athlone would throw stones at bread trucks when they came through. And the bread company was not happy with that, and they complained to the police, and the police decided that they would put a stop to this. And they found a really, really clever way of doing this. They decided that they were going to put several soldiers or police officers, I cannot recall exactly which, into a bread truck, and then they were going to cut the roof off the bread truck, and when the kids threw stones at the bread truck, they would leap up and they would shoot them. And then they would learn their lesson and they wouldn't do it again. And so that's what they did. It's called the Trojan horse incident, for obvious reasons, the bread truck being the Trojan horse. And that's a sort of a makeshift memorial. I don't think you can see it all that well, but it's a makeshift memorial for the teenagers who died on that day.